So, today we're talking about something called the Hartl Doctrine. It sounds pretty official, right? But you can think of it as a legal key designed for an almost impossible lock. It was born from a question that sounds like it's straight out of a thriller novel, but for some people, it's terrifyingly real. I mean, really think about that for a second. What happens when the court, the very institution you'd run to for justice, is part of the crime you're trying to fight? Normally, if you think a judgment was fraudulent, you appeal. Simple enough. But what if the entire system you're appealing to is what you believe is the problem? Where on earth do you even start? Well, for the Hartl family, this wasn't just some abstract legal puzzle. This was their life. Their long, tangled legal battle in Arizona is the very reason this doctrine even exists. They claimed they were up against a massive conspiracy, a network of public officials and private companies that was, in their words, systematically stripping the value right out of their properties. So how did the system become a weapon in their eyes? To really get it, you have to look at how they felt the whole legal machine was being turned against them. And the paper trail they left behind? Well, it tells a pretty powerful story of confusion, frustration, and ultimately defiance. And just look at this. The power here is in how simple and direct it is. This isn't some fancy legal document filled with jargon. It's a raw, human, handwritten note. I do not consent. That's it. It's an incredibly potent statement from someone who feels like the entire process has gone completely off the rails, that it's no longer legitimate. And this one document just perfectly captures the chaos of their situation. You've got a court notice here for Keith Hartl, but it's being redirected to him at the Maricopa County Jail. It just goes to show you how tangled up all these legal issues became with every single part of their lives. I mean, how are you even supposed to navigate something like that? Okay, so you're facing what feels like an all-powerful system. The Hartls decided a simple appeal just wasn't going to cut it. They went way bigger. They alleged a full-blown criminal conspiracy, and they used a very specific and very powerful federal law to do it. They brought out the big guns, the RICO Act. Yeah, that RICO Act, the one designed to take down the mafia. See, RICO doesn't just go after individual crimes, it targets the whole criminal enterprise. So by using it, the Hartls were making a huge statement. They weren't just saying a judge made a mistake. No, they were saying this was organized crime. And they didn't hold back. They named names, arguing this wasn't just one rogue actor, but a whole coordinated network. I mean, just look at this list of defendants. It really shows you the sheer scale of what they were alleging. You've got the city of Phoenix, a bunch of property and title companies. They were claiming this was all one massive coordinated scheme. So how did they try to prove it? Well, they pointed to what lawyers like to call badges of fraud. Think of them as little red flags. Any single one on its own might have an innocent explanation, but when you see them all together, they start to paint a really suspicious picture. We're talking about things like transferring valuable properties for literally $10, or trustees conveying property to their own relatives. They argued it wasn't a coincidence, it was a pattern. But, and this is a huge but, there was a massive problem. Even with all these incredible allegations, they ran smack into a legal brick wall. It's a principle that's been around for about 100 years, and it's specifically designed to keep state and federal courts in their own lanes. It's called the Rooker-Feldman Doctrine, and it's a really big deal in the American legal system. The basic idea is simple. Lower federal courts cannot act like appeals courts for state court decisions. Only the U.S. Supreme Court can do that. So your local federal court, it's not allowed to touch a state court's judgment, period. And here's the bottom line. The whole system is set up to stop exactly what the Hartls wanted to do. You can't just lose in state court, get mad, and then run over to the federal courthouse to ask for a do-over. The doctrine is there to make sure state court rulings are final and respected. For the Hartls, this wasn't just a hurdle. This was the impossible lock on the door. So what do? Well, what if you could argue that you're not actually asking for a do-over? What if you could say that the state court's judgment wasn't really a judgment at all, but more like an artifact of a crime? This is where the Hartl Doctrine comes in. This is the key they tried to forge. So here it is, the Hartl Doctrine. It makes a really clever argument. It says that if a state court judgment was obtained through what's called extrinsic fraud, that stuff happening outside the actual courtroom, like bribery or fake evidence, and if that fraud was part of a larger RICO crime, then that judgment was never a real judgment to begin with. It's void ab initio, a fancy legal term for void from the start, a constitutional nothing. And this is the best way to understand it. Think about a bank robbery. The doctrine says the real injury isn't the court ruling against you. The real injury is the racketeering scheme. That's the bank robbery itself. And the court judgment? That was just the getaway car. So you're not asking the federal court to critique the state judge's driving. You're asking the federal court to investigate the robbery.
And it's not just a clever idea. It has a structure. It rests on what it calls the 3 pillars of process integrity, which ask 3 simple but powerful questions. First, was the whole thing based on a valid law? Second, did the person affected get proper notice and a chance to be heard? And third, was everything done in good faith? If you can show the answer to all 3 is no, the doctrine argues you're not just looking at a simple mistake. You're looking at evidence of a criminal scheme.
So when you put them side by side, it becomes crystal clear. Rooker-Feldman says the injury is the bad state court judgment. The Hartl Doctrine says, no, the injury is the federal crime of racketeering, and that state judgment was just one of the tools they used. See how that completely reframes the whole issue? It takes what looks like a legitimate court ruling and turns it into a piece of evidence. It's a really brilliant piece of legal thinking, right? The perfect key for the impossible lock. But how does it actually hold up in a real courtroom? Well, this is where theory meets reality, and the story gets a whole lot more complicated. The biggest wall it's hit is something called the intertwined claim problem. Essentially, federal judges look at this argument and say, okay, I get the getaway car analogy, but in practice, these things are just too tangled up. They feel like they can't possibly investigate the robbery without also having to second-guess and basically rejudge the original state court case, which is exactly what Rooker-Feldman says they can't do. And let's be honest, there's a huge amount of institutional resistance here. Think about it. For a federal judge to basically declare that an entire state court case was a complete sham, that is a monumental step. It goes against this core principle called comity, which is really just about mutual respect between the state and federal court systems. It's a line that judges are understandably very, very reluctant to cross. Okay, so if this doctrine faces such a tough uphill battle, why even talk about it? Why does it matter? Because the ideas at its core, those 3 pillars of process integrity, are just so fundamentally important, and they pop up in some really surprising places. Believe it or not, there's a fascinating connection here to the world of IT governance and security. The principles are basically the same. Statutory authority? That's like regulatory compliance in IT. You have to operate within a defined set of rules. Proper notice and hearing? That's like data mapping, knowing all the stakeholders. And good faith execution? That's the equivalent of data immutability, the principle that a record can't be tampered with. It's all about the integrity of the process. So in the end, the Hartl Doctrine is so much more than just one family's legal battle. It's a framework that forces us to look at a really fundamental tension in our entire legal system. It makes us step back and ask a much bigger question. What happens when the very institutions designed to protect us are the ones being questioned? And that's really the question that lingers, isn't it? In this ongoing fight for justice, where is that line? Where does protecting the system end and challenging it begin? At what point does defending the finality of a judgment start to feel like you're actually shielding corruption? The Hartl Doctrine may not have all the answers, but it sure does an amazing job of forcing us to ask some really tough and really important questions.